I was talking with a friend recently, and we were comparing notes about who we thought maybe were the Dhamma practitioners who were both born and raised in America and had taken their practice all the way to its completion. And as far as I know, the only person who fulfills both those parameters and is widely renowned to be an arhat is Ompor Sumedho. But for every one person who steps so much into the public eye and agrees to be known as such, for every one practitioner like that, then there are, as I understand it, several more who are in the closet, or in the arhat closet. So I was comparing notes with my friend, and we were kind of just taking educated guesses about who might be finished, but mysterious and not known as such by the public. And my friend was taking some guesses, and I heard some names that I recognized, and I also heard a name that I had never heard of before. So I asked her, "What is this person like?" And she told me a little bit of this and that. And then I said, "Is that person very sweet?" And my friend was like, "Yeah, yeah, total sweetie. Why do you ask that? How did you guess?" And I was like, "Well, I have this theory, and I want to share that theory with you as well." And the theory is rooted in the yin yang energy principles of Chinese medicine. And it's that in order for any being or organism to come into being, it needs to have a balance of yin and yang energy. So one time I was talking with my sister, who is a Chinese medicine doctor, and she was teaching me about this principle. So she said, yin energy is environments that are dim, moist, damp, dark, nighttime. And yang energy environments are bright, afternoon, dry heat, like the desert. So then my sister turned to me and she said, "Can you guess if a mushroom is yin or yang energy? Can you guess if a cactus is mostly yin or yang energy?" And I said, "Well, a mushroom grows in dim, dark, moist environments, so it must be very yin. And a cactus grows in hot, dry heat in the desert, it must be very yang." And she was like, "Oh ho ho, you are totally wrong." And remember that any organism needs to have a balance of yin and yang. So mushrooms, which grow in the most yin environment, are actually a very yang food. And cacti, which grow in the most yang environment, they are a very yin organism. So think how we use aloe to heal our sunburns, right? It's a very yin property, yin cooling effect on the body. And I think this can also be applied to the people who take their practice all the way to its finish. So I think that when I think back to the famous Dhutaṅga monks like Ajahn Mun, even when I just draw his portrait, like his photographic portrait to my mind right now, I think of his very stern gaze, how it pierces through the camera, it pierces through my being when I look at it. And, Ajahn Mun, Ajahn Mahabua, very famous for being really strict disciplinarians, like huge authority figures who could shrivel your liver, whose nickname was the tiger. And they grew up in this environment, which I was never at personally. So what I know is only what I pick up from their biographies and from visiting Thailand and hearing from people who are residents of Thailand. But of course, Thailand is known as the land of smiles. Um, the Thai heat is famous for being very hot and humid, inducing lethargy and fatigue often. When I read about the biographies at the time that these monks came of age, there was very little central government touching their villages sometimes, like almost no paved roads connecting their households and their villages from the next. So oftentimes villages would be just clusters of as little as just a small handful of families living closer together so they could help each other survive in the dense forest. And I think it would make sense that out of this very yin environment, the people who took their path to its finish and then became prominent figures of Dhamma in that environment, it makes sense to me that they would be very stern, a lot of yang energy in their personas and personalities. Versus America, United States, there's a lot of yang energy here. uh, I think it was really hard for me to even see this until I got to know people who grew up in different countries and until I really traveled more extensively outside of the United States and not just traveled there, but really got to know locals and other ways of life outside of the United States. But in the States, we are, generally speaking, crushed by the boot of capitalism. And the worth of a person is decided by how much output they make, how much they shop, how much money they make. There is like this huge hustle and grind culture that I think has just attenuated a little bit in the past few years, but it's still extremely strong. The way I see people work at most companies, it's not healthy. And then there's this like extreme way that people like throw themselves at work until they have nothing left in the tank and then rebound and just totally break down. But then when they pick themselves up, usually it's like this cycle of throwing oneself into work until breaking down and then throwing oneself into work again. I see this a lot in the corporate culture. Judging people based on our jobs, our status, prestige. It's a lot. This nonstop feeling of needing to be productive, only taking a break when it feels like it's earned. And not just that, but like this fallacy of being able to pick oneself up by the bootstraps, which I learned that the origin of this phrase of picking oneself up by the bootstraps is started as kind of a joke. It started as an intentional farce of like, haha, isn't that hilarious? The idea of picking oneself up by the bootstraps. But now people use that phrase seriously and they think I can muscle my way out of any predicament, which I can see the beautiful part of that sentiment. It's that we each can impact where our lives go, and we like the idea of having agency over what happens in our lives is important to our well-being. And the extent to which the American culture takes it is ridiculous. Like this hyper individualism, this idea of like I can make anyone and anything bend to my will, I can dominate anyone and anything is a huge problem and detrimental to anyone's well-being. And is very, very young, is so young. This energy, yikes. Okay, it's a little too young. So I was actually reading when I was getting my graduate degree in teaching, we were learning about these different cultures and how some cultures are very individualistic, some cultures are very collectivist, and there was a list that ranked the top 10 individualistic countries in the world, and the United States ranked as number one. And just as a side note, there was also a top 10 list of the most collectivist countries in the world. And China, which is the land of my ancestors, was ranked as number one. And so I was like, okay, the country from which my family descends and then the country in which I was raised, born and raised and brought up in are both number one on these opposite lists. So that explains a lot of why my childhood was so hard. But anyway, the United States, number one, most hyper individualistic. So, of course, following that yin yang theory, uh, I think the ones who make it all the way to the end of the practice are, in general, quite sweet. Warm, friendly, patient, sensitive, and of course, imperfect and flawed, and everyone has their grumpy days, but just speaking in general, quite sweet. So why is this important to consider and contemplate in Dhamma practice? Is because if we only look at Dhutaṅga monks as our examples, and if we model our own practice after those of the Dhutaṅga monks, then maybe it will not always be helpful. And maybe as many beautiful jewels of wisdom as there are in their teachings, if we model the form of our practice after the form of their practice to a T, maybe it would even exacerbate some conditions in ourselves as Westerners, and especially if you are watching as a United States born and raised person, maybe it will even exacerbate some things that are already part of your conditioning. And maybe what we need in practice is balance. The balance of being actively passive and passively active. That middle way is what we're after. So I'm bringing all of this up to say that if we only model the form of our practice after the form of someone else's practice, maybe it's not always helpful, because maybe, and I know this for sure, I know for a fact I am not a Dhutaṅga monk, and there were some ways in which my practice, even when it was very, very rich, or maybe when it was the most rich and the most inspired and motivated, maybe it actually looked really different from the practices of Ajahn Mun and Ajahn Mahabua, etc. And by the way, in reading Stillness Flowing, the biography of Ajahn Chah, it specifically noted that he would often, when he dealt with the Western monks versus the Thai monks, they seemed to bring out really different sides of his personality. And often he would be a lot more stern with the Thai monks and a lot friendlier and joking with the Western monks. So why? Why would he have done that? What can we learn from that and incorporate into our own practice? So maybe it will be helpful if I share some of the ways that my attachments have loosened or even been put down in ways that looked really different from the practice of a Dhutaṅga monk. And the first thing that jumps out at me in my memory is, I think in the globalized modern world, there's this premium placed on eating fancy food, like food porn, taking pictures of food, making really special dates to go and eat food, going really far out of one's way to stand in line for a long time and eat food. And like, I still enjoy going out to a slightly specialer meal once in a while on slightly specialer occasions, birthdays, anniversaries, etc. And there was this one time when I had a really good friend at a time in my life who was very wealthy. So for her birthday, she invited me and two other of her close friends out to a very famous New York City restaurant. This was at a time when I lived in Manhattan and worked in advertising, and that's a whole different story. But we were all going to dinner in this one meal, and she was going to treat everybody because she knew that if she expected us to pay for ourselves, we would not go. But this one meal was going to cost her $1,200 for the four of us. And I think that's before tax and tip. But we went to this special dinner in this skyscraper. It's one of the restaurants of one of the most famous celebrity chefs of our time. And I was excited to try it, but then I remember sitting there and I had a really close relationship with my friend whose birthday it was, and just tepid relationships with our other two friends. So dish after dish after dish came out of the kitchen, and I think it was like 17 courses total, like 12 savory and five sweet or something like that, five dessert courses. And just because of the nature of the relationships at the table, I remember, like, as fun as it was to see the new dish as it came out and as delicious as they were, and as much as I respect that there is an incredible amount of skill and artistry in those dishes, I just wasn't having fun. We were trying so hard to have fun. And I was also noticing that we were trying so hard and it just wasn't really working. And as dish after dish came out, I noticed that we were becoming, or at least I was becoming, really uncomfortably full. And still, we all had to pretend like we were having such a great time because our friend was paying for us, paying a ridiculous amount of money for us to eat all this food and become so terribly uncomfortable. Then, at a certain point in the dinner, I looked around the dining room and I noticed that it didn't seem like anybody else was having fun either. Anybody else in that dining room eating that meal. I remember so distinctly there was a couple to my right sitting by the window. It looked like they were maybe celebrating a wedding anniversary or something, but they were not talking at all. They were just looking at their phones, looking at their watches, looking out the window. And every time a dish came, they would jump into action, cutting their food and eating their food, chewing their food. But I was just looking around and thinking, this is so empty. What is the point of all of this? And a lot of attachment to food and food experiences softened and melted away that night in the middle of a two Michelin star restaurant. And that's a story you're not going to hear in the biography of a Dhutaṅga monk. I remember sitting there and just being like, all this food is going to turn into poop. Like, why all this fanfare? And yes, I understand that there is a certain kind of artistry that goes into conceiving of those dishes and making those dishes. And in the end, it all turns to poop. And if we were not even having fun sitting there, turning that food into poop, then there really is no point. I think a lot of people in the Western world, in the modern world, grow up having this feeling like prestige is important, having a meaningful job, leaving behind some kind of meaningful legacy is important. And there is, of course, something beautiful in that. I think within that, maybe there can be sometimes an intention of wanting to do a lot of good for people, and that attachment, that whole value of chasing prestige and leaving a legacy creates a lot of suffering. And in working with this, I remember a huge milestone moment was, I've tried a lot of different careers in my life, just going from different field to different field, entertainment to advertising to education to mental health to design, looking for meaning, looking for what was going to be something that gave me sustainable happiness. And it's not going to come from a job. Even the most glamorous sounding or the most humanitarian sounding job if it gives a person meaning, it's because they are practicing well at their job. That's what I think anyway. But I remember this moment when I was working in entertainment and I was assisting on a lot of photo shoots for celebrities. And oh my gosh, even just saying it now, it feels so, so empty to just even say that. But at the time, I thought everybody, so many people want to be here in this position, in this field. So let me check it out and see if there's any truth to it. Spoiler, there's not, but but I was a lot of people who wanted to be photographers, like their dream, at least in the editorial celebrity entertainment field of photography, their dream was to have a billboard that they shot go on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. And I happened to assist on one such photo shoot. And of course, I was not the photographer, but I was involved enough. So I thought that maybe when the photo shoot was printed onto that billboard, and maybe if I drove up to Sunset Boulevard and parked my car and got out and gazed upon that billboard, maybe it wouldn't feel quite as empty as it actually did. But I got out of the car, stood onto the sidewalk, and I just thought, wow, this means nothing. There was no point, no point to this. And a lot of attachment to prestige melted away, softened away at that point. It wasn't completely gone yet. I still had a little bit more exploring to do, but that's another story that you would never read in the bio of a Dhutaṅga monk. But still rich practice. And then a lot of people, and I will just speak for myself, I guess, but I was really conditioned from early childhood, really conditioned to want to be a mother and to have, especially like to make a biological baby. Given a lot of dolls as I was raised, and I heard a lot of language like when you become a mother one day. And now, especially in retrospect, I think of all the ways that the adults in my life and the people in my life would speak about other adults who had no children in a way that was imbued with pity or judgment and just unfairness. Growing up, I just had all of this conditioning. So, of course, when I had been married to Kyle for a while, and even when we first started dating, we would talk about how much we wanted to have kids one day. And then we tried to conceive for a couple of years, and it got to the point where we were really distraught about the fact that we were still not having a successful pregnancy. And it got to the point that every time my period came, and we obviously did not get pregnant in that cycle, I would just weep. I would just weep and wail into Kyle's shoulder. And at one point, Kyle just turned to me and said, I have a lot of compassion for what you're going through because we're going through this together. And I feel also upset whenever it doesn't work out. And there's something about the degree to which you weep and wail that makes me feel like this experience might be really rich and fruitful for you to investigate in meditation. Like Kyle is so tactful. And of course, it helps that I was open to hear that. So when Kyle said that to me, I went into meditation and just really contemplated where the suffering was coming from and took a step back, took a step up from that feeling of devastation and just observed it, bowed to my suffering, and opened my heart to whatever I could learn from it, however I could grow from this suffering. And this insight arose of all of the ways that I had been conditioned to want to have a baby, and especially all the ways that I had been conditioned through all this language and all the baby dolls that I had played with growing up, and all the other just BS conditioning in the society in which I live, the world and culture in which I live. All this conditioning that a person only reaches their full form when they have a biological child. And I laugh now because it just is so, seems so silly now. But I remember in that meditation, the feeling of seeing it clearly, finally. And as soon as I saw it clearly, then I didn't have to believe it anymore. And when I didn't believe it anymore, so much attachment to so much attachment to having a baby, becoming a mother just fell away. And I felt free from it, freer than I had ever been. And at that point, I still had a little bit more investigation to go before I could really put that attachment down fully. But that was very, very rich practice for me that day. And now when I think about every time that our trying to conceive did not work, every time I think about the pregnancy loss that we had, I just feel grateful. One more story about what practice might look like in the modern Western world. But there was this thing that happened at work where I was in a meeting with my manager, and it was toward the end of the year, 1 year. And she just told me, at that point, I had only been hired on for a few months, but she told me in the meeting, Grace, there were a few leaders on this account who we got together, just talked about your performance, and we realized that we had offered you much too low of a salary to start. And to right size that, we would like to give you a 22% raise and a big Christmas bonus. And of course, in my mind, there was a very worldly kind of pleasure. It was like the pleasure centers of my brain were just going wee woo, wee woo. But at the same time, there was also this really dramatic loosening of attachment to money. And a lot of that came from believing that everybody in the corporate world must be just an extractive jerk. And, and I must really have to protect myself all the time when I'm in the corporate world. And everybody is just trying to use me for everything I've got. And this feeling of dog eat dog, every person for themselves. But when my manager said that to me, and I thought, I had never imagined that such a conversation would be possible in the corporate world. So when my manager said that to me, I felt this huge loosening in my whole system of, wow, maybe I don't have to protect myself so much. Maybe I can not trust everybody in the corporate world, but at least really deeply trust the people I'm working with and trust the fact that there is so much goodness in the world, is so much goodness in people, and not every single person, but there is so much goodness in people, and I don't have to guard myself and guard money as much as I thought that I did. And there was a lot of loosening of attachment in that moment. And then, when I read the biographies of the Dhutaṅga monks, and I love reading those biographies, and I find so much inspiration in them. And there is this sense of restrictiveness in a lot of what I read about the way they used resources and material goods and donations. And I see how that can be very helpful. And in my own practice with money and material goods, I've noticed that a little bit of looseness also really helps me. So not restrictiveness, like not just tightening the belt as tight as it can possibly go, but you know, having humble desires. And because the desires are humble, then they are easily met with just a small extra joy once in a while. Going on a kayak trip on the weekend, treating myself to a dessert. I don't know, just like also not being restrictive. Restraint, but not restriction. There's an ocean of difference. And I think a lot of that comes from my background too. Like growing up with a sense of a lot of restriction and finding that middle way for myself with the help of those who practice well around me as well. And then there's working with bodily pain, the idea of being in meditation and staying in the same posture even when it hurts, which I have done that at times in my practice. And there have been times in my practice when it was extremely fruitful. And it's not something I do anymore. But I will say that in the times when it was very fruitful, I was really led into staying in that posture from a place of curiosity and wonder. And even though it hurt in my body, it hurt in my hips or knees or something, there was also a seed of joy and pleasure in it, of like, let's see where this goes. I think there's something good behind here. And in the times when I went into uh, more austere practice with that mentality, it has always been really inspirational, very fruitful, very forward leading. And the same thing with the first few times when I tried that precept of not eating after midday. There was such a sense of curiosity and fun in it. And I think that's what makes it a practice of restraint for me rather than a practice of restriction. It's like, I like really heavy pressured massages. So sometimes it hurts, but in a really good way. It hurts in a way where there's something loosening, there's something going into alignment in my body. And I know by this intuitive knowing in my body, in my mind, I know that it's going to be awesome afterward as well. So I bring all this up to say it can be very fruitful. I think it could be a really interesting exercise to look into our own backgrounds and see what there is a lot of. So in my own background, I grew up in a really highly academic, highly competitive environment as a child of immigrants and a grandchild of war refugees from the communist war in China. So I grew up with a lot of restriction, a lot of striving and pushing, forcing. So what's been really helpful for me to find that middle way was bringing in wonder, play, a little more wiggle room, really. And then what else is useful in finding what form will be best for our own practice, I think, is being very mindful of our intention going into it. Are we trying to recreate the form of someone else's practice? Or are we finding the middle way for ourselves? And then mindfulness during whatever that practice looks like. Is it the kind of pain that feels good or the kind of pain that will require surgery later? And that's an intuitive knowing. And then, of course, mindfulness after the practice or after whatever form you're trying. What are the results? Is there more tightness? Is there more veering off to whatever side of the middle way you started off from? Or is there relief? Is there spiritual happiness, spiritual pleasure? And that is what I wish for every single one of you.